My guest today was the Chief Administrative Officer, the CAO for the region of Waterloo from 1991 to 2004. Before that, he obtained an engineering degree from McMaster and then obtained a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Waterloo. He started working for the Ontario Ministry of Transportation before coming to the region of Waterloo as a senior transportation planner in 1973. He moved through the region, having been at different times the Director of Planning, Director of Transportation, Director of Facilities, and Commissioner of Engineering before becoming the CAO in 1991 and stayed there in that position until 2003. His time as CAO for the region of Waterloo and before was one of tremendous opportunity and change. In 2003, he was honored with the Lieutenant Governor's Medal of Distinction. And it's my honor to welcome today to the Old Grey Mayor's podcast, Gerry Thompson. Gerry, hello.
Actually, I stayed till 2004.
Oh, sorry, 2004.
No problem.
Okay. There must have been some that wanted to get you out of there earlier, I guess.
Yeah. No worry.
So, listen, thank you very much for being part of this today, because I've done about 25 or so of these podcasts with various people, usually, former politicians, because I find I don't want to talk to current politicians because they'd have to be, cryptic and selective about what they say. But the former people who have left office usually are a little more open to what they have to say. But I'm really glad. But I guess, if Waterloo Region had a larger body of water, you would have built a beautiful community and stayed here rather than moving out to BC.
Well, that might be true. Yeah. Yeah. We spent a lot of time sailing on Georgian Bay, which was 2 hours from where we lived. So this is a lot handier. That's true.
Yeah. Because you're where are you located now then? You're in BC, but where in BC?
We're in the Noose Bay. It's a large bay off the Strait of Georgia, and it's about 2 hours north of Victoria, and just slightly south of a community called Parksville.
Yeah,
As you mentioned in your introduction, I started working for the Ministry of Transportation and Communications back in, 1971, I guess, and maybe 70. Anyway, be that as it may, during the period I was there, I was a transportation planning engineer working in the Niagara Peninsula, particularly, and was involved with the Ontario's first regional official plan, which was the region of Niagara's official plan. I was the liaison officer there, and I was seconded to a variety of things while I was with the Ministry of Transportation, including, as I mentioned at one point, an econometric model of tourism in Ontario, which really doesn't have an awful lot to do with transportation. But I had a background in computer modeling at that point. And then subsequently, an capital investment model for the province for transportation. And in that connection, I happened to come in the latter one. I happened to come in contact with a company by the name of Reed Voorhees, which is an amalgamation of a local Don Mills company in Toronto with the Allen M. Voorhees organization out of Washington, D.C. We were doing the investment model, and that really was the thing that propelled me into the regional job. As I found out later, I was working for. After the ministry, I was working for a private consulting company. I was doing a transportation plan for the city of Guelph, actually, at that time, and had a call from a man named Jack Young, who I had never heard of. And I was not aware that the region of Waterloo had even been formed. I had moved on. I saw my career going in the Toronto direction. And
well, just on that for a second, Gerry, you grew up in Galt, Cambridge, correct?
Yes, I grew up in Galt. That's right.
Yeah, so you're a lad of the region, so to speak.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, although it's interesting to reflect back now. When in growing up in Galt, it was a very cloistered kind of growing up, small town, 17 or 18,000 people, and a trip to Kitchener in my youth was a major undertaking. So although we were part of Waterloo County, of course, I think I was cognizant of that, but still my world was very small.
Yeah. Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
as you indicated, I went to McMaster and followed my educational path and worked first of all for the Ministry of Transportation, and then with these secondments. And then I had this call from Jack Young, and I put him off a little bit at first, which was probably kind of a silly thing to do, but youth has its follies. And he called back anyway and insisted that we get together at the old Charcoal Steakhouse in Kitchener. And I agreed to that. So I joined both he and Bill Thompson at the Steakhouse.
And Jack Young, just to put it in context, he was the chair of the Regional Waterloo at that time, correct?
I wasn't aware of it, but yes.
Yeah.
Regional amalgamation occurred, or was effective on January the 1st, 1973. And the first regional chairs right across the board were appointed by the province, specifically by Darcy McHugh, who was the Ministry of Treasury and Economic Development with the province at that time. So, and there was a connection between Jack and Darcy, which I didn't know at the time. But anyway, Jack was appointed as the first chair. And so that's why I met with he and his new Commissioner of Planning, Bill Thompson. And so they outlined what this was all about. They brought me up to date with respect to the formation of the region of Waterloo. It was a very embryonic organization at that point in time, hardly formed. I think we had maybe 60 employees, something like that.
Oh, wow.
It was very small. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I immediately took to both Jack and Bill. I really I liked them as individuals. I was enthralled by their vision of what could be for my old hometown area. And as I got to know them more and more, that respect just grew. And I really liked the idea of being part of a team to build something from scratch, not just join something. Oh, there's nothing wrong with that, but this was an opportunity to do something very significant right from the beginning.
This is and like that, if this was Gerry, if this was a tech startup, you would have been employee 17, and by the time you left, you would have been a billionaire.
I try not to think of it in those terms, Rob.
I know you're a higher calling than me.
Well, I don't know, but I did work for private interests for a while, and I found that the public interest was what really enthralled me. So so I followed that course.
You know what? Just hold that thought for a second, because Mike Murray, I interviewed Mike Murray for the podcast, yes. And he said something along the exact same lines. And what he said was he was working in private. He was an engineer working way up north. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
And he came to realize that when they were working for various municipalities, the people that seemed to be calling the shots, so to speak, were the engineers on staff. And he said, yes. That's the guy I wanted to be. Right? So it's similar to what you're saying, similar concept.
Yeah, I think maybe that is changing somewhat now, but certainly in my time and in Mike's time, that was certainly the case. And not to make too much of it, but Mike was, I guess, my protege in many respects. And,
yes.
And so we shared a lot of values.
Yes, Gerry begat Mike.
I used to tell Mike, this is the best job in the world. You get to do things that you'd never get to do anywhere else.
Yeah.
You know, if you have the will to do them and the talent to do them.
Well, let's talk about those early days. And so Jack Young's the chair of this thing called the regional. It was called the Regional Waterloo, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So what was so this had basically established the two-tier government that we have.
That's right.
And I guess there would have been thoughts of, will this ever, we won't get too far down the line, but whether this would ever become one entity. Was there ever talk back then, and like at that dinner at the Charcoal, that this could become one large city at some point?
Oh, not at the Charcoal Steakhouse meeting, no. But over time, sure, that conversation did in fact occur.
Well, we recognize that. We'll save that for another show. But
we'll save that for another one. Yeah.
I was just curious if that ever came up, sort of in that.
No. At that point in time, we took it for what it was.
Okay.
regional government. And it was something that was being promoted across the province, including Metropolitan Toronto, which was a regional government as well. And it was all of these regional governments at the time were the brainchild of Darcy McHugh, who was the treasurer and intergovernmental affairs
So
minister.
what was it that enticed you? Do you recall from that, like they were impressive people? And Bill,
Yeah.
what was Bill's role at the time?
Well, I think what impressed me was they made it clear to me that we had an opportunity to build something really fantastic and to build it in a way that was not constrained by previous precedents or ways of doing things. We had a completely blank sheet to deal with. And that I found just to be absolutely enticing and thrilling because, you know, when you get you don't get that opportunity many times.
Right.
That's
right.
what really drew me.
So you start out then as the senior transportation planner.
Yes, that's correct.
And what is the focus at that time for you when you're getting
Well,
there?
there's a very minor backstory to that one. I joined the region of Waterloo. I showed up on my first day of work, which I think was in July or August of 1973. The Marsland Center was not completed, but that's where our offices were. There were wires hanging on the ceilings. The floors weren't finished.
Wow.
And there was a steel case desk in the middle of the floor, and there were 3 or 4 of us, and the tape was still on them. We had to pull it off. And I was sitting there wondering, okay, I bought this vision from Jack and from Bill, and now I'm here. So now what? And so
Yeah.
the first chief administrative officer was Whit Bradley, who had been the city engineer in Kitchener previously.
Okay.
And a very, very nice man. And Whit came around anyway and stopped at my desk. I didn't know who this man was, but he introduced himself. And he said, well, I'm told that we needed somebody like you. He said, I have no idea what you do, but whatever it is, just do it. So that tells you how much of a concept I had too of exactly, specifically what I was supposed to do.
No job description.
No job description.
So Jack, how long did Jack Young stay as regional chair?
Jack, he was 2 terms. I'm trying to remember, just as you asked the question, how long the first term was. They were shorter than the current terms.
Yeah,
it was 2 or 3
years. 2 years.
2 years. I think maybe even 2 years. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it went from 2 eventually to 3 and then to 4.
Right. So it would have been 2 years. He served as an appointed chair, and then he had to run for election after that if he wished to retain the position. And election at that time was by regional council itself. So he had to run as a regional councillor for the city of Kitchener as an alderman, essentially.
Yeah, so it was the councillors around the horseshoe
who elected the chair.
Who elected the chair
from among their group. I think they actually had the capacity, the ability to elect someone from outside the circle, but that never happened, of course.
Right. So you tell an interesting story about Morley Rosenberg and his view of the appointed Jack Young.
Jack was an unusual person and still remains a person who I, from time to time, ruminate over. I had a wonderful relationship with Jack, but I wasn't the only one that did. Jack had wonderful relationships with a lot of people. He was a charismatic individual who could see the big picture, was not constrained by partisan politics in the slightest. A good idea was a good idea wherever it came from. And he had served in the Second World War as a search and rescue guy and contracted
tuberculosis
and wound up in the Freeport Sanitarium.
But hold on, but just before that though, you glossed over, this is impressive. What did he do during the war? You said search and rescue. He was jumping out.
Oh, he jumped out of an airplane to rescue down flyers in the English Channel.
Yeah, like that is unbelievable.
Which tells you something about the man too,
Yes.
Yeah. So he did contract tuberculosis, unfortunately, wound up in the Freeport Sanitarium, and they had crafts, various things for people to do to keep them busy. And Jack selected leather working, and I guess he got to be quite good at it. So when he got out of the Freeport Sanatorium, cured, he opened a company called Custom Leather in Kitchener, which was on Victoria Street, actually, right where our health sciences campus is now for the University of Waterloo.
Right.
And he was also a very active conservative, so he was involved with the provincial conservative government of the day, knew Darcy McHugh well and others, and did some economic development work for the Ontario government, setting up economic consuls in various places in the U.S. and even abroad. So he was a mover and a shaker from the beginning. He had been as well a member of Kitchener Council as an alderman, and had at one time chaired the planning committee for the city of Kitchener. So he was familiar with planning concepts, and he was a very, and I mean this in a very broad way, a very entrepreneurial person. He was a make it happen kind of individual.
Right. I love those
So
people.
that's the man that I was dealing with at the Charcoal Steakhouse, and we can get into it when you want to. But he became a mentor of me, but many others as well. I mean, he didn't restrict it to one or two people, and also mentored a number of embryonic businesses in the area that kind of needed a father figure to get them going.
So yeah, a man of good advice and vision.
He was. He certainly was.
So he's appointed. How do the other councillors take to him being appointed as the regional chair?
Well, I think generally speaking, it was fine. Jack was a person that was, in fact, easy to get along with. Not to saying he was a rollover, he wasn't, but he was a gentleman, and it was very obvious to everyone. There was opposition to the formation of regional government. Of course, he inherited some of that antipathy. It comes with the territory. Yeah. But it wasn't particularly personal, except between he and Morley Rosenberg, who was on Kitchener Council at that time. Yes. And they had some bitter fights, which would looking at them in hindsight, although they were considered to be serious at the time, were a little bit comic.
So you look at it now as a classic.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Didn't Morley call Jack a political hack, and that's why he wanted to run so he could show
Morley? Yes. Well, Morley was an NDP, so he was very much partisan. And of course, Jack being representing the conservative camp, so to speak, although he was never partisan in the way. Morley would go after him as a political hack, and they would go at it. Sometimes with these encounters first occurred, you kind of think, what the heck is going on here? But it became more commonplace, and that was just part of the territory.
There are good stories to talk about now. Not speaking ill of anyone, just some good stories to share.
Right,
It's the flavor of Kitchener, blue collar town. It's the flavor of it all. A good rough and tumble political tumble.
Oh yeah.
So what was one of the, like, you worked on a lot of major things during your time, and we're not going to touch on like hardly any of them, but we're talking about Toyota, we're talking about Uniroyal in Elmira,
right?
We're talking about airport stuff, and we're talking about what we will talk about is the regional official plan.
Yes.
Was that one of the first sort of major projects that you were working on when you came to the region?
Yes, it was. There were four of us that had been recruited by Bill and Jack, and I found this out over time. It wasn't immediately aware. One was Wendy Wright, who had been a senior planner with the city of Kitchener. Another was Frank Waddy, who was recruited for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. Another fellow was had been the planner for the county. He lasted a very short time and was replaced by Mark Dorfman from the private sector.
Right.
And then of course Bill was the leader of the team. And our first big project, in fact, was the official plan. Frank looked after environmental things. Wendy looked after housing. Mark looked after development issues, and I looked after the transportation side of it, and Bill was the leader of our team.
Right.
And Bill, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Bill was Commissioner of Planning, correct?
He was appointed Commissioner of Planning at the outset.
Yeah.
There was an attempt, and it was a very wise move, to take senior officials from the various area municipalities and place them in positions of responsibility with the region. Not only had they the local experience and had lived through the days of the Waterloo South Wellington study, which was a precursor to the region, so they had a lot of in-depth background from that. But it also made the transition politically easier as well, because you didn't have an automatic opposition sitting back in the weeds criticizing what was happening. They were part of the go forward
Right,
plan.
right.
Yeah,
It's sort of like they're homegrown talent. They came from the farm system.
that's right. Exactly. Came from the farm system. Yeah. So Bill, you cut me off. I'm leaving
Yeah, no,
it to
no, you're doing great. So, so Bill came to you guys and basically what was sort of the concept here behind this official plan that you were going to be putting together?
to that point in time, the early 70s, official plans in Ontario and everywhere for that matter consisted primarily of land use designations, geographically allocating certain areas of a city or a region for a particular kind of development, perhaps putting some rules in place, defining a special subject area or study area, that kind of thing. And Bill considered that a rather not an effective way to plan. It was prescriptive for one thing, and it wasn't heavy on process. And he wanted to develop a process-oriented plan, and he called it a policies plan. So rather than specifying everything and prescribing everything, what he did was set up the processes and the policies to evolve the plan on an ongoing basis. So we were the first, again, at his insistence, or his instigation, we were the first to have a very heavily environmental official plan with an environmental emphasis to identify environmentally sensitive areas and the policies surrounding them, and the first to develop policies for development and all kinds of other topics associated with planning, so that there was a broad outline geographically of a plan, but fundamentally it was a process to achieve results.
Right.
And in hindsight, and certainly at the time, we believed in what we were doing as well. But it turned out to be a very, very forward-thinking attitude to have taken. And so we completed the plan from 73 to 77. It was published in 77, and it was published to quite a series of accolades. It was the first policies plan in Ontario, maybe the first in Canada for that matter. So it really was a groundbreaker. It's not uncommon now, but at the time it was considered to be very radical. And
it set a tone. It set a tone, and one of the things I think a lot of people don't appreciate is if you want to understand a community, and where they're going, it's two things. Take a look at the budget, because that's what they're going to be spending their money on. But take a look at their official plan and see what their priorities are in terms of moving forward.
That's right. And this, if this plan left any impression on a reader for first-time reading, it would have been that the environment is truly valued, not just given lip sync to, but truly valued. Yeah. It would have highlighted the fact that public participation in the best sense was a key feature of the plan. And it would have highlighted the fact that this was intended to be a living plan to evolve over the years as policies changed and morphed and became more refined. So I think those are the things that would have struck a person from a first reading. So, this is different in this respect. Yeah,
and it sets a tone. It reminds me, I was just thinking, I did a podcast with Jean Halboom.
Yes, remember Jean? I remember Jean.
Yeah, and so this was before she was elected. So she was like a community advocate in the where Homer Watson Village.
I remember her district, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, and she talks about changing this line in the regional plan, and the map in the regional plan. There was a road. It was supposed to be like a collector road that was going to be coming through, and it would have been a pretty substantial road in the community, and I think disruptive to the neighborhood. And she talks about a years-long campaign through public education and advocacy to get that changed over time. But that was the important thing, was identifying that line in the plan and getting it changed to create the type of community you want to have.
Right. I don't remember, to be honest with you, I don't remember that specific example, but It rings true. It rings true.
Yes. So the regional plan then, so your part is the transportation. So let's talk about that. What was your contribution then to that regional plan?
It was several-fold. It developed a transportation model for the region, a computer-oriented systems planning model to redefine or reconfirm needs for various transportation facilities in the region. And again, from a policies perspective, to indicate how we would deal with these projects over time from a policy point of view. And I should say that I mentioned the team, the four juniors, if you like, and Bill.
Yeah.
We collaborated on everything. I mean, we all each discussed each other's work, and it wasn't compartmentalized in that sense. But my responsibility was as I described it. So, and that led to, well, again, if I'm jumping in, that led to the identification of what we described in the first plan as the Central Transportation Corridor.
Yeah, and to put it in perspective, the Conestoga Parkway or Expressway or whatever, that was already established by time
that was done. It was virtually almost completely finished when I joined the region, but it was a done deal. Yeah. That was the brainchild of Bill and Whit Bradley, our first chief administrator, formerly the commissioner of engineering for the city of Kitchener. And others, I'm sure, but they were the two prime movers for the Conestoga Park.
Right. So they would have been through quite a community upheaval about that whole project initially themselves.
They were seasoned veterans.
Yeah. And a few
although they were seasoned veterans, but in the day that they did that work, it was more common to do that kind of thing. Right. And even though it was disruptive, and it certainly was disruptive, it was more accepted that the disruption was worth the end result. Yeah. As things changed over time, and Jane Jacobs and the movement with the Spadina Expressway and all that kind of thing, the moods changed with respect to how the public would accept and react to these kind of projects. Right. So they were, from their point of view, in terms of wanting to build an expressway, they were probably at the tail end of a golden era when you could sort of get away with it.
Yeah, right, right.
But they went through their share nonetheless. They were seasoned veterans.
Yeah, I mean, some people might appreciate having that in terms of getting us moved from the north to the south end of the region or what have you. And Waterloo obviously came on board with that project back in the day to extend that up to their neck of the woods, to the north end of the region. But by the time, and you raise a good point, because even in Jean Halboom's podcast, I'd mentioned to you, she met Jane Jacobs during that whole Stop the Spadina period. She was in Toronto then and brought some of that advocacy back to our community. But that's interesting that you say it was sort of near the end of the golden era, because now this leads us to the transit discussion, right? In terms of the Central Transit Corridor. So what was the thinking then? You're saying obviously it was moving away from sprawl.
Yes, as we all know, the region of Waterloo sits in the very fortuitous position of having very high class agricultural land around most of the perimeter of the region, and valuable aggregate resources on the other side of the region. Yeah. And it was a prime objective in our plan to limit sprawl. Absolutely. We did not want to jump the line, as most communities had in fact done, and annexed parcels, adjacent to the original municipality. We did not want to go that route. So that meant that there were a couple of considerations. We did not want to do that. We didn't want to encourage sprawl. At the same time, we recognized that we had a linear form of development. And if you look at the map, it's pretty obvious from North Waterloo right through to Cambridge. Yeah. So we recognized that the geographical reality of what we had. We didn't want to have the sprawl. So how do you deal with it? One of the ways to prevent sprawl, because growth was not going to be prohibited, that was clear, is to go up, not out. In other words, to densify as opposed to sprawling out into low density suburbs. So we had to achieve an increased density. So how do you do that? One of the ways you do that is to produce what we call the Central Transportation Corridor. Densify in that corridor, provide an effective transportation link from top to bottom in the region, around which people can cluster in a more densified way, and which attracts investment to that core area for development. And
so just before we get into all of that, you said you didn't want to jump the line, which made me think, because today what it said is it's hold the line, right? It's
right, yeah. But jump the line was the norm in those days.
Yeah,
And there
yeah.
were
So you
all
wanted to
kinds of,
stop that, stop jumping the line. So hold
yeah,
that
there were all
countryside
kinds of
line.
municipal board hearings concerning municipalities that were jumping the line,
Yeah.
we didn't want to get into that, and we didn't. So,
But
so
it,
that
but
that
it,
motive,
but Gerry, I just want to just stop for a sec.
yep,
So we're looking. This is like 1973 to 77,
yes,
and I think it's quite visionary at that time to be thinking about those sorts of issues and coming up with this concept because of the end goal being trying to limit the sprawl and
yes,
protect farmland. And some people might not be happy about protecting aggregate, but aggregate is a
the
provincial
valuable
resource.
resource.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
people don't
Yeah, it
realize.
was visionary, and that's why the plan, I think, was accorded the congratulations that it eventually got. It was
Yeah.
different than what had happened in other places.
So
So,
this
so that,
central corridor, then how did that concept come about then that this would be a central transit? Just because when you looked at the alignment of the cities on a map, they were like from north to south, they were pretty well in a straight line, so to speak.
yeah, in large part. I mean, I won't deny that it was a geographical fact that we were laid out in that fashion, and
Yeah.
take advantage of it. I had also come in contact with the concept in a very oblique way when I was one of my many secondments was seconded to work on the Kitchener Area Highway Plan by the Ministry of Transportation. These were all plans that preceded the region, but there were various things being floated about, and the Waterloo South Wellington study, which had a major transportation component, was also in play around that time. It was published in 1972. So there was a lot of background information. Like, we weren't operating in a vacuum at all.
Right.
We had to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together,
Yeah.
but there were a lot of pieces that were out there. It just took some imagination to craft it together in a way that made some sense relative to our objectives. So there was the development side of it, not skipping the line, if you like, and intensifying and attracting investment to that corridor. There were social objectives as well. It was our view, and certainly my view, that bringing together in close proximity creates a kind of social capital, which in its
Right.
best form generates tolerance, understanding, communication, and innovation. And innovation is in Waterloo is a touch.
Yes.
It's an
Yes.
important word. So all of these things, it was an engineering challenge. It was a planning challenge, and it was a social challenge as well, a social science kind of challenge.
So when you were putting that line on the map,
Yes,
what did you have a vision of what it would be, like
yes.
in terms of the practicality? What were you seeing going down that line?
I saw light rail transit going down that line from
So
the
back
very
then,
from
back in
the
73.
first day. Yeah, but the public were not ready for that at that point in time. So we didn't specify any technology in the Central Transportation Corridor. We said it would be an enhanced transportation corridor, and we basically left it to that. Some things, time has to be right. A number of things have to come together.
Right.
Politically, socially, there's a whole collection of considerations
Yeah.
and you have to be with your time, but not so far ahead of your time that you collapse onto yourself.
Right. Correct.
So
Because,
the
but Gerry, I just want to ask you, like it wasn't as late as the 50s that we had streetcars in Kitchener?
that's an interesting point, Rob. In many ways, we were just reinventing the past. I can remember riding the streetcar, the urban interurban rail with my mother from Galt to Kitchener to go shopping.
So there you go. It was
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff. People say, "Why isn't this visionary?" Well, a lot of things, it seems to be a trend today, which I really bothers me. Are conclusions and decisions made out of context, with no context into them at all. There was an historical context here.
Yeah.
There was,
Yeah.
but people had forgotten about it. General Motors had put the streetcar system out of business in Kitchener and everybody else and everywhere else on the continent. People moved on. It was modern. It was going to be different.
Right.
Well, some things they may take a slightly different form, but the roots of some of these things are very deep.
Sometimes people would argue, though, they would say, well, we already did that, so we shouldn't be going back to that.
Yes. Well, that's a concept that I have trouble with because I also am very interested in history, and I think that the roots of today's decisions and conclusions are very often rooted in history. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, but there are echoes.
Sure, and we can learn from all of that. Okay,
Of course we can. Yeah,
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 and it's a good point because, as you said, by the time you get to the point of the Conestoga Expressway, that's sort of the
yeah,
tail end of the remnants of the quote golden era of the car
yeah.
and urban sprawl. But that's the purpose of planning, isn't it? To look
It is the purpose of
decades
planning.
into the
At its
future.
best, it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
And actually, you talk about when I came to some of my own conclusions. Yes, I did think light rail transit from the very beginning. And in 1979, I laid out the route with all of the stations. It was a preliminary functional plan, but I laid it out at that point in time. And the final route, the one we see today, is not exactly the same, but bears a lot of resemblance in different areas of the city.
did you split it in downtown Kitchener?
We went down Charles Street.
Yeah, Charles.
I think there was one on King, and then the other leg of it was on Charles.
So what happens now is they split between it's Charles and Duke. So as it enters downtown Kitchener, it splits out into Charles and Duke, and then matches up again as it goes up.
And it differs in Waterloo from what I laid out as well. But it went all the way from the Conestoga Market Mall at North Waterloo, through to Main Street in Galt.
In Galt.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the way down. Okay.
Yeah, and utilized existing rail lines where it was possible to use them.
Yeah. So why have rail lines and not just have like an adapted or upgraded bus type service?
Well, it was my view, and I think it's held to be true in a variety of places around the continent, that if you're looking to attract and anchor investment, the only thing that does it is surability and permanence. Investors don't want to come to put their money down for something that might move to somewhere else somewhere later. I mean, they want to know what they've got. And steel wheel on rail gives that kind of permanence. I mean, you really have to, as you know very well, you really have to dig up the city to put one of these things in. It's not a fly-by-night commitment. When you make that kind of commitment, you're solid.
That's multiple decades long.
Yep. And that says to an investor, this is here to stay. So I can invest around this concept and have a reasonable assurance that it's going to yield a return for me that makes sense. So
and this permits or encourages that development like the condo towers or apartment buildings or what have you around these stations. So it's the upward development versus outward development.
That's right. And we even talked about things as broad as lessening type 2 diabetes by building this thing. Because what we were doing was making the city more walkable. Right.
And the more healthier community.
So it had a social dimension, as I mentioned to you, the social capital, the social cohesion side of it. It had an equity dimension to it, equity of opportunity for place of work and residence. Yeah. It had health benefits. These concepts are there. I think sometimes people think, oh, this is just another one dreamed up by some engineer, you know.
His name
but
is Gerry.
It's much broader and deeper than that.
You know, you're right. And it's interesting because one thing I had never thought about when I was chatting with Ken Sealing.
Yeah.
And we were talking about affordable housing, for example.
Yes.
And, you know, there's always this concept that all your services are sort of centralized in the core of your communities.
Yes.
But by having a transit system like this, that's easily accessible and gets you from point A to point B a lot easier, you now reach a broader geographic area and more opportunities for affordable housing options than just being centralized in one area.
And work opportunities become
all of that.
Equitably distributed. Yeah. I'm trying to do the same thing in British Columbia, but I'm not having the same success.
You know, it's too bad. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I ran for regional chair in the last election. And I did this one day. I went out and about on the transit
Yes,
bus. Just, went from Waterloo in the north down to Main Street, as you
right.
say. I got a little bit sick because of the travel, but that's my own problem. But it's interesting that, and I made a point of chatting with people on the bus because I wanted to understand where they were coming from, what they do.
Sure.
And you get new Canadians, you get people at the lower end of the socioeconomic
Yep. Mhm.
range. But the transit is so important and so vital to get to a job, to get to school or training, to get to the
Yep.
food bank, to go visit family. It is a vital link, and it's this whole sort of world you don't see, but you get out there and you start to understand how
You
important
get a
it.
better picture of it. And the other point, just to pick on what you just pick up on what you just said, high class transit, like rail transit is a high class transit, brings people of all walks of life together too, because it
True.
it isn't just the disadvantaged person one way or another
Right.
that's riding the train. It's everybody,
Yeah,
and social integration
that's
is
a good point.
it's a fundamental thing.
And we were seeing that just prior to COVID with the ION.
Yeah.
Ridership was up. You were seeing all sorts of people, different walks
Yep.
of life that were on there. It was great. It was
Yeah.
really good. It was really improving. So we'll see what
Yeah.
happens post COVID. Or you know what? I can't say post COVID. As we learn to live with COVID or
As we learn
whatever.
to live with the remnants of COVID. Yeah.
Yeah,
Of COVID.
exactly. Because
Yeah.
I don't know
But
if
I
there is
guess the real key takeaway from this, from my perspective, is yes, building the light rail ION's job of building it is a major engineering challenge. That's true.
yeah.
But the conceptualization of the whole thing is not specifically an engineering project. It's a social project of broad dimension.
Yes, yes, exactly. So let me ask you though. So you said in '79 you laid out
Yeah,
um,
a
uh,
route.
the route,
Yeah.
but the region wasn't ready to build it in '79, were they?
No, but I was ready. No, they weren't. That took a lot longer. But
I mean,
yeah,
okay. Let me ask you this then. This is a good
yeah,
question here now. So here you have a staff who is keen on a project,
right.
but you don't get to vote on whether this goes
No,
ahead or not.
no. But you get to
So
steed ideas.
see, this is I totally agree with this. This is what at the point I think I was making with Mike too. Mike, I said to Mike, I said, yeah, the politicians maybe endorse it, but they're influenced a little bit.
They're influenced a lot. You know,
Yeah.
we and I say that in a kindly way.
I
They,
know.
in my view, over my many years, I've probably dealt with hundreds of regional councillors. Actually,
Yeah.
uh, they were very good at picking up on good ideas, endorsing them, and putting the necessary political energy behind them to get things done.
Well,
But
look at the
but
politicians need to work with staff because look at what's the background. I'm a lawyer. I'm not an engineer. I
yeah,
wasn't a medical professional. So you need staff to be able to guide you so that you can make those common sense decisions.
that's right. Yeah, exactly. You're in the adjudicating role,
Yeah,
but you have to have something to adjudicate too.
right. You need some meat on the
Yeah.
bone, and that's where
So if
staff
if
gives you.
ideas are not flowing from the staff to the council, and the council isn't, taking those ideas seriously and making judgments with respect to them, and you don't have a workable system.
Well, and if you look at a municipality is like this living, breathing thing that has a
Yeah.
lifeline to it,
Yeah.
and counselors come in and out in 2, 3, or 4 year periods. Some of them stay a
Sure.
longer time, but there's changeover.
Oh
But
yeah.
a lot of times, staff are the continuity of it all. They're the consistent thing all the way through.
That's right. And that was something in my management approach that I focused on. A lot of CAOs were in my time what I call carpetbaggers. You know?
Except for you and Mike.
And I didn't want to be a carpetbagger. Anyway, so we focused on people. We
Right,
focused on developing people, making them be able to realize their career objectives within our organization, or
right.
even helping them to move to a better fit somewhere else. We would help them with that too.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we proposed very, very rich training programs, which council endorsed, and they were expensive.
Yes.
But we did everything to invest in our people. And by and large, they did stay. And they
Yeah.
formed a continuum and a corporate memory relative to all of these things, which was invaluable over time.
Now, there's two things I want to touch on with respect to transit here,
Yeah.
and two broad things. One is the concept of developing the feeder system, which we talked about, okay, in terms
Yes.
of the buses. And the other thing is the lobbying work you had to do to get this idea to a point of acceptance in terms of the environmental assessment.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, so in 79, you've got the stations laid out, and is that your stations that you laid out, was that part of an official plan or just a report that you had tucked away?
Simply the latter. It wasn't part of
Okay.
the official plan.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, I was always trying to advance the idea, you know, little
Yes.
by little.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things, and you've mentioned this, in order to have a good light rail transit system, you need a
Yeah.
good feeder system to
Yes.
feed that, because it only serves the central corridor. You got to bring people to it.
You have to bring people to it. That's right. So
But the region didn't control the buses at the
no, the
time.
region didn't control the public, the bus system. No, it didn't. And there was a bus system existing in Cambridge, and Kitchener's bus system served Waterloo by contract. So there were two bus systems, if you like.
Right.
And then you're right, there has to be a feeder system to make it work. So we had to have control over the routes and the operation of that feeder system, which we did not have at that time. However, the Regional Act of 1973 made taking over the municipal bus systems permissible. We had the ability to do it. All it took was, I shouldn't say all it took, but what it took was a vote of regional council to do it. If they voted in favor of assuming the local bus systems, it would happen, but it took a vote of regional council.
Yeah.
And until we got the light rail thing advanced far enough that people had this in their heads, they kind of knew where we were going and how it all fit together.
Right.
And we had been through some other assumptions of other responsibilities as well. They'd experienced the political process related to that a little bit already. So the whole thing had matured. The environment for making that decision had matured, and the idea itself had matured.
So let me just delve on that for a second. Are you talking about the John Sweeney work that he was doing at the time?
John Sweeney was commissioned to do a review of the region.
Yeah.
And he did. And well, I mean, John was a good guy. I like John, but the report didn't go anywhere.
So was he commissioned by the region or the province? Who?
It was commissioned by the province. It was the intention of the province from time to time with these regional governments to commission a review, see how things were going, take the pulse of progress. And so there had been one prior to John Sweeney as well. I can't remember who did it, but there was one. And then John and Sweeney's came along, and it was, I don't mean to underread, it was confirmatory, if anything.
Okay.
You know, it was confirmatory. So that had not really much bearing.
Okay. So
although being confirmatory is a good thing, because it said to people, "Oh, this thing's here to stay. It's not going to disappear."
Was he? We'll talk about maybe another day. We're going to talk about amalgamation and one tier versus two tier, and Sweeney would probably be part of that. But also, Harris was looking at amalgamation, and Kitchener-Waterloo region avoided that amalgamation.
Yes, they did. It is my understanding that right up to the last minute on that issue, Waterloo region was on the list for amalgamation.
Yeah, and why was it off? Why was it off the list?
Politics. Politics and politicians. You can appreciate that if amalgamation had taken place, there would have been a reorganization of the nest.
Nobody likes to.
Some would have been in the nest. Some would have been outside the nest, and some that perceived that they might be outside the nest were not in favor.
Right. So then transit. So then that leads me to transit came shortly after that, didn't it? Is that when transit came to the region? Wasn't it shortly after that? Around 98?
No. I'm trying to remember, Rob, but it was Before that, transit came to the region before that.
Okay.
Yeah. So we needed the bus systems. That's the long and the short of it, to make a comprehensive, make a system out of it, not just a bunch
Gotcha.
of systems. Yeah. And so regional council, again, there was a bit of a backstory, although it wasn't a tortuous backstory, but they eventually voted on the matter and voted to assume the public transit systems.
But was
For
the
us to assume them.
backstory that they came to appreciate that this was necessary for the central transit, or was
They
there some
did.
other story?
We had talked about it enough. I guess I had talked about it enough. They actually understood the morphology of the thing. They understood how it had to come together. You had to put the jigsaw pieces together.
Because
so they
transit was a money loser, wasn't it? I mean, they weren't making money with transit.
No, the Kitchener Waterloo end of the transit system, run by the city of Kitchener, was a more robust system than the city of Cambridge.
Right.
But both of them were not. They weren't big money makers. No. And so, I mean, and that might have come into it as well. I mean, if it's not a money maker, give it to the region, see what they could do with it.
Yeah. But there was resistance. So you had mentioned there was resistance to the region taking over, like Kitchener Transit, for example.
Yeah, the politicians on regional council really did not have a problem with this whole thing. I don't remember what the vote split might have been, but it was a substantial vote in favor of doing it. And I don't remember who argued what to be. Well, Doug Craig would have argued against it, of course. That's just a matter of principle. True to form. I mean, you just put that one aside, forget about it. Yeah. But anyway, the rest of regional council, I recall them being quite supportive. Waterloo, I don't remember them having a huge problem with it. Of course, they were already buying service from the city of Kitchener. The Kitchener politicians, though the main body of whom were actually regional councillors as well, were in favor of it. So that meant that from a formal point of view in the city of Kitchener, there was not really any opposition.
Right.
The chief administrator of the day was John Gazzola. He had been their treasurer, became chief administrator. And John was dismayed and absolutely heartbroken over this thing. It was, in his view, and I understand how these things work. He viewed it as a gross intrusion into his empire, so to speak. And of course, that had nothing to do with the matter at all. But that's how he took it. And he remained disconsolate for a long period of time. And so I had never supported it.
So now you have the transit, but now you need to get in order for this project to really take off. The environmental assessment has to happen, correct?
Yes, and just before we leave the transit, that's not saying assuming the transit makes it kind of a simple thing. But actually, there's a total reorganization of staff, union relationships. I mean, it's quite a complex thing to absorb an organization that large. But yes, so now we had to.
Sorry, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. So
no, on that, no.
But I'm interested in the part you undertook in terms of the lobbying you did to secure funding.
During this same period, I was very heavily involved, and as I might have mentioned at one time or another, well beyond my traditional job description, a long way beyond it.
Yes.
And Ken and I were agreed on that it wasn't a problem. He was happy to see me go and do it. So that's fine. I did it, and I was happy doing it. So I spent a lot of time lobbying both the provincial government at the ministerial level and the federal government at the ministerial level, and some at the deputy minister level in the federal government, for instance, the Ministry of Infrastructure, but the deputy minister of infrastructure. But I went through several cabinet ministers over a period of time as governments changed and people changed portfolios. Spent a lot of time in Ottawa, met with the caucus of the party. It was very, very political. And the message that I was attempting to sell at that point in time was that making this investment on the part of the provincial and federal governments, particularly the federal government, was a nation building exercise, was part of nation building. It was of importance to Canada, not just importance to the region of Waterloo.
Right.
And to that end, I had enlisted the help of Larry Smith, economist with the region of Waterloo, to calculate the GDP of the region so that we could put some numbers to what I was arguing. And it turned out, based on Larry's studies, that we were the 10th largest regional economy in the country.
Wow.
Bigger than New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland together, and almost as big as Nova Scotia. So I was able to make the point.
Yeah.
This is not just some isolated regional project out there in the boonies.
Right.
This is important, and it's important in itself. It's important to establish a precedent of doing this kind of thing, of actually taking the lead and building infrastructure of this sort to build our urban capacity, because we are an urban nation, Canada.
Yes.
We don't
Yes.
think of ourselves sometimes that way, but we
No.
are a very urban nation.
No, we
And
think
so-
about hewers of wood and drawers of water.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So over time, and with all the people I talked to, and I had good relations, I get along with people, I convinced them. It's as simple as that. And so that culminated, after many machinations, culminated in Alan Tonks, who was, I think, Minister of Transport at that given time, probably in early 2004. Memory escapes me a little bit here. I'm getting older, Rob.
Well, your memory's pretty good. Your memory's pretty good, Gerry.
Came to town to announce the decision that the federal government was going to support the project. They knew how much it was going to cost. They knew it would be about $1 billion. And they were coming to town to support the project. The first stage of their commitment would be funding the environmental assessment,
Right.
which is actually, that's the first step in implementation. It's not a step that at the end of which you say, maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't.
Right.
It really is the first step of implementation. So we knew that we had it in the bag at that point in time.
So it was happening, but for some unforeseen political circumstance or what have you.
Yeah,
It
I mean,
was
some
pretty well done
cataclysm,
deal.
I guess, could have happened, but yeah, basically it was in the bag.
Yeah.
And so there was much rejoicing on the regional part, politically as well as staff, because by this time, they really wanted to do this. They saw the benefit in doing, they saw what it would make of the Tri-City area. It would, you render them it's an overworked term, but a world-class operation as opposed to just another place in Ontario.
Yeah.
And we wanted to establish a precedent, as I said, for doing this kind of thing across the country. And actually, we borrowed the team that went to Oregon. We borrowed a lot of our early research from Portland, Oregon, who had done an absolutely bang-up job. So we had many visits to Portland, Oregon, to learn from them with respect to not only the technology of light rail, but some of the social dimensions that I mentioned to you, and about the concept of real estate uplift and all of these things. We brought back from Oregon. They were very, very helpful to us.
So this approval from the federal government, the funding confirmation, was one of the last things that you had
Yes.
undertaken before you passed the baton on to Mike Murray.
On to Mike Murray, exactly. Yeah. I think we had, in that period, we had 3 strategic focus areas. One was the light rail transit, clearly. Another was the airport,
Right.
developing it as to what it is. And the other was the research and development park at the University of Waterloo. For the research park, I managed, I won't go into any detail, to finagle $40 million to get that started and get provincial approval.
Yeah.
The airport we developed, as you've seen it developed, and
Yeah.
building the terminal, all extending the runways, taxiways, and that kind of thing.
Yes.
And of course, the light rail was basically on its way at that point as of the environmental assessment. So I was around for the first part of the environmental assessment, meeting with the project team and that.
Yeah.
And then I departed the scene and eventually joined the University of Waterloo.
Okay. So
I figured I had done what I could do.
yes, for sure, and carried it a long way. You carried that ball a long way in football terms, that's for sure, and not the wrong way Thompson analogy.
Yeah. Well, we really had, and I don't mean to be, trite about it. We really had good teams of people.
Yeah.
I mean, they were. I mean, I just can't say enough. They were
No,
dedicated.
I agree with you about the region.
Yeah.
So listen, Gerry, we're going to end today's show here, okay?
Yep.
And if you
Sure
don't
thing.
mind, I'd be glad to have you come back at a future date to talk some more about your activities and shenanigans in the region.
It'd be my pleasure.
Okay, listen,
And
thanks
thanks
a
for
lot.
doing it.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for making the time. So this has been another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. I want to thank you for having listened and tagged along with us. Thanks again. All the best.